I recently led a painting retreat to France. I had a fantastic time there and I took a ton of reference photos. I love the beautiful old stone and the archways, and you feel like you're really seeing a part of history. And so in the painting that I'm looking at today with you, I'm gonna create the texture of one of these walls. I'm gonna walk you through what I do in my first wash and middle values and how I finish this area to make this texture seem believable. I really want this archway to be a prominent part of the painting, so I have it arranged right over here within the scene. After I've laid out my drawing, I'm going to lay in a nice wet into wet wash into this painting. And what I always do first is I wet down the back of my paper and the front of my paper, and I lay that flat on my surface. Now the first thing I do here is I'm taking some really warm color. Typically, I start with the lightest and warmest area of the scene first. And here, I'm laying in a really light warm color for the light that's showing on the stone. So we always want to think about the light first in the painting. And we paint from light to dark. And understanding where the brightest part of your painting is when you're getting started is very helpful. So now while this is light, I'm laying in some more warm tone. And at this stage, this is giving me a little bit of variation even within that light area of the stone. So I'll have areas like here, which are a little lighter, and areas here, which are a little darker. And by laying this in while the scene is wet into wet, I get some lovely soft changes in value on that stone wall. And now as I move away from that area of the wall, I know that everywhere else needs to be darker, and so I'm loading up my brush using more pigment as I go. So I laid in a little bit of light area for that chimney on top of the building, a little bit of greens over here because I know that some of those trees are going to be catching the light, and now I'm laying in some value for the road. And the temptation when you are painting in your first wash is to go too light, and a lot of students lay in a really weak wash for the first wash of their painting. But I'm telling you, push those values. Use a little more paint than you think you need to. Lay in some rich color and value in that first wash of the painting. That way, when you get into your middle values and your darks, there won't be such a jump in value. It won't be really, really light and then really dark for the middle values and the darks. The sky is dark in this scene, as you can see from the reference photo. So this little bit of blue I'm laying in here is not the final value for the sky. I'm basically taking away the white of the paper. And then when we get into our next wash, I will lay in a really rich blue wash for the sky, and that will allow the light on the stone to be as bright as it needs to be. Even in this first wash, I'm thinking about my figures. I'm laying in a little bit of skin tone, a little bit of color, some light tone for the fabric of their clothing. And it's really good to build your figures into the scene. Don't just think of them as an afterthought. I like to think of figures, they have the same complexity as the rest of your painting. There are light values, there are middle values, and darks. So when I'm laying in those washes on my painting, I want to incorporate my figures into each of those washes as well. My paper is damp, and I've loaded up this smaller synthetic brush. And the reason why I'm using this smaller synthetic brush here, I don't want a lot of water into anything I'm doing on the paper right now. I've laid in this delicate wash, and if I use a brush that holds a lot of water, it's just going to run down the page and mess up that wash. So what I'm doing is using this smaller synthetic brush, loading up more paint and less water, and while this paper is damp, I'm getting more of those subtle variations in color. So some nice wet into wet, soft edges, but changes on the stone. So you can see on the face of this stone, there are little bits of color. There's more parts of the stone that are warmer. There's little bits that are more yellow, that have more of a red look to them. By dropping that in now, just like I did earlier in this wash, I can get these nice, subtle little value changes on the face of the stone. The last thing I do before I call this done is I threw a little bit of warmth in here because there's going to be some light shining on the grass there, and I also lifted just a few little directional lines leading us into the scene as well. Okay, this is what it looks like when my paper is dry. Now I'm ready to get into the middle values of the scene. And the first thing I want to do is lay in a very rich blue wash for the sky. Typically I paint the sky in the first wash. In this painting, I need it to be in the second wash because I really want that sky to be strong enough to let the light be very visible on the stone here. So what I'm doing is I'm starting at the top of my paper, I'm working my way down with a really rich blue wash of pigment. That's Cobalt Blue and Cerulean. Now when I get to the roof line, I'm loading up a brush with some paint for the roof of the building. So I want to go ahead and now paint this, and I like the look of this because it's nice to have some soft edges in the painting. That way I'm getting to it while it's still wet, and so it's not a super hard edge up here. It's a little bit softer, and I think that adds something nice to the painting. While I'm painting this large connected shape, I want to be sure and mix up my colors. I don't want to mix up, too much of just one color and use that all over the painting. I want to keep adding a little bit of variety. So I've grabbed a little bit of blue and some warmer colors, and I don't know if you can see that here, but I'm mixing in right around into this area, getting a little bit of variety in the wash. And now this is still damp, and there are some darker areas at the top of the wall I wanted to go ahead and tie in. And I'm working on the shadow underneath this part of the building, and as much as I can, looking for ways to connect this shape. So I went from the shadow right into the tree shape into here, dropped in a little bit of darks while this tree area was damp, looking for areas here that I can connect back into this middle value shape. So I pulled a little bit of value from that stone down there. I wanted to make sure and show the sky showing through that little gateway, because that's an important part of the painting, and we want to see some sky down there as well. All right, and now I'm into a little bit of the background, a little bit of the value of the actual stone and arch, brought that down onto the street level. And you can see here, I wanted to connect these figures into this wash. So while this was damp, while I'm laying this in, I wanted to connect a darker version of the first color that I used on their clothing. And I've talked about this in a lot of other videos, but thinking through your painting in light side and shadow side, and adding in some lighter values of one color, and when you come into the middle value shape, tying in a darker version of that color into the middle value shape, and then you get a lovely little light side shadow side effect on whatever it is you're painting, whether it's figures or cars or some other object. Okay, you can see that the painting is starting to develop. We're getting the middle values and we have the light values already in place. And I'm connecting the shadow down into the shadow that's being cast across the road here, and I worked my way down, and again, just like I did in the roof, I'm mixing up some different colors in this shadow shape. A little bit warmer here, some cooler here, and I'm warming it up as we go down here. That gives us a little bit of variety. And one thing I noticed was the shadow under the arch right here was warmer. The shadow that was under here tended to be cooler. So having a nice variation of cooler colors and warmer colors is always a nice thing. Now I'm starting to look into the little bits of texture, the little bits of detail that are going to make this look realistic. So I'm going around the scene, and now that I've laid in a lot of the shadow shape in the middle value, I'm looking to see what some darks can add to that. I don't want to be too heavy-handed. Like most things in watercolor, I want to take my time and add in some darks carefully throughout the scene. So I'm working my way through, getting some darks to help the windows look more finished. And now it's time to start working on the stone. So far on the stone, we've laid in the light values, and you can see those subtle little changes in color that I dropped in all the way back in the first wash. Look how nice those look now. That would have been very plain if I had just laid in all one color in the first wash and just left it at that. But by adding a little bit of variation, it looks more believable. It looks more lifelike. It looks like what we see. Now what I'm doing here is carefully adding in some texture. There are little cracks in this stone wall, and where those cracks are, the light doesn't quite get into there, so there's some darker shadows. And when we combine some of these softer color changes with a few of these dark lines, then we're really starting to see that texture of the wall come to life. Now, I say this all the time, I might sound like a broken record, but when you are painting this texture, you don't want to try to paint every little mark that you see in your photo. What I'm doing here is I'm looking at a few marks, I'm placing them, and then I'm moving on to another area. And the hope is I don't get so invested and honed in on one area that I just overburden it with details and texture. Because what I don't want to do is paint this whole entire wall with every single line for every single stone. We're trying to create an impression here. And so carefully adding in a few of these lines, taking a step back, looking at your work, does it need a little bit more? Is it good? Can I move on to another area? So I wanted to show the kind of the curve of the arch, and I added a few little lines there. And it's starting to come together. I put a few little lines of texture on the house, put a little bit of dry brush on this here, and I felt like this area needed a little more detail and texture as well. This painting, it's coming together. We're getting a good feeling of light. We're finally getting the full use of all of our range of values, the lights all the way through to the darks. One thing that really brings your paintings together are directional lines. It is amazing to me once you get these lines in how much of a difference that it can make. Also, I don't know if you remember, I lifted off some of those directional lines with a dry brush when this was still wet. See that little faint line there? That's what that did. And this little faint line here, it all adds up to make it feel believable. Now I'm using a little bit more dark and running a directional line from there with some dry brush. I felt like my figures need a few more darks to kind of finish them up. And what I'm left with is this. There's a look at the final scene. But we have to remember that it's a process. We're not going to get there in our first wash by jumping ahead. We have to remember what we're trying to accomplish within each step. Have you ever been really excited about a painting and you get all set up, you find that right reference that you're excited about, and then it's time to go and you feel lost? You ever had that experience? Well, I have a free resource that I want to give to you today that can help with these problems. My 5 steps to plan a successful watercolor painting. I walk you through the crucial planning phase of your painting that will help you understand what you're going to paint first, second, and third. The planning is really so important, especially in watercolor. This medium is harder to correct. It's so immediate. So having that plan is very important. I send you a PDF that you can download. And the great thing about this is you can have it on your phone, you could print it out, and you can take a look at these crucial planning steps before you start each painting. All you have to do is follow this link here and download my 5-step guide to planning a successful watercolor painting.